He saw her hands first. That was the order of it. He came to the kitchen door of the Greer boarding house about a supply order, the way he came every third Thursday, and the woman at the basin had her back to him, and her hands in the water. And he saw, before she turned, the way she was holding herself. Not the posture of a woman washing dishes. The posture of a woman making herself as small as the space allowed, her shoulders drawn in, her neck angled down, the specific compression of a person who has learned that taking up space is a thing with consequences. Then she turned, and he saw her face. He did not make a sound. He did not change his expression. He had enough control of himself to do that much, and he stood in the doorway, with his hat in his hands and his jaw set, and he said, "Good morning," and she said, "Good morning," back, and they both understood that neither of them was talking about the morning. Her name was Nell Crane, and she had been at the Greer boarding house for 11 months, which was how long she had been married to Frank Greer, who owned it. She had come to Morrow, Wyoming the previous November, on what she had understood to be a reasonable arrangement with a man she had met through a Cheyenne agency that matched women in uncertain circumstances with men in need of household help, and the arrangement had seemed, in the reading of it, like a practical solution to the problem of being 24 years old, with no family and no money and no particular prospects, in a territory where those three conditions, in combination, left a woman with very few doors that opened from the inside. She had grown up on a small farm outside of Sheridan, the second of 3 daughters, and she had been the one who cooked and kept the accounts and managed the household from the time she was 14, when her mother's health began its long decline. Because someone had to, and she was the one who knew how. Her father had been a decent man who died when she was 19, leaving the farm to a cousin who had no use for 3 adult daughters, and said so in terms that were practical rather than cruel, which did not make them easier to absorb. The eldest sister had married, the youngest had gone to work in Sheridan as a schoolteacher's aide. Nell had gone to Cheyenne with $30 and a set of skills that were genuinely useful, and that the world declined to pay fairly for, which was the specific trap that the agency offered to help with. Frank Greer had seemed reasonable in the letters. He had a boarding house with 6 rooms and a steady income from the ranch hands and traveling men who used it, and he needed someone to cook and clean and manage the household, and he had proposed marriage rather than employment, because he said it was a more stable arrangement for both of them. And she had believed him because she had needed to believe someone. The letters had been kind. The marriage had not been. She had not told anyone. That was the part that people who had never been inside that kind of situation did not understand, the way the not telling becomes its own structure, self-reinforcing, because telling requires believing that someone will do something, and believing that someone will do something requires having evidence that the world works that way. And the evidence she had for the past 11 months had been pointing in a different direction. She managed the boarding house. She cooked for the boarders. She kept the rooms and the accounts and the kitchen, and she put one foot in front of the other every day. And she did not tell anyone, because telling felt like one more thing she could not afford to have go wrong. The cowboy in the doorway was named Trace Dowell, and he ran a horse operation 8 miles north of Morrow, and he had been coming to the Greer boarding house on the 3rd Thursday of every month for 2 years, for the supply order that Frank Greer arranged through his mercantile connection. He had spoken to Nell perhaps a dozen times in the months she had been there, the ordinary brief exchanges of a man who comes for a supply order and the woman who manages the household that processes it, and he had been, in those exchanges, the kind of man who looked at the person he was speaking to rather than through them, which, she had noticed, without letting herself do anything with the noticing. She turned back to the dishes. She did not know what else to do. The morning was the morning, and the dishes were the dishes, and there was no version of what was happening that she could see a path through. Behind her, she heard him set something down on the table. She heard him not leave. Nell, her name in his mouth the first time with any weight in it. She had heard it said, by everyone in Morrow, as a noun, as the person who ran the Greer place, as Frank's wife, as the woman at the counter, or the woman in the kitchen. She had not heard it said the way he said it, which was as a person he was specifically addressing, because he intended her to hear the specific thing he was about to say. She kept her hands in the water. "Dry your hands." His voice was quiet and flat. the voice of a man saying a thing he has decided rather than a thing he is proposing. "You're done here." She stood at the basin for a moment that held everything she had been not choosing for 11 months, and then she dried her hands on the cloth by the basin and she turned around. This is Dusty Vows. This story is a harder one than some we tell here, and if any part of it is close to something you know, we want you to know you are not alone. National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-SAFE. You can also text STRT to 88788. Now, and gently, back to the story. He did not ask her if she was sure. He did not ask her what she wanted to take. He did not stand in the kitchen and have a conversation about it, because the conversation was not the thing the moment needed. What it needed was the door, and the door was open, and he held it. She took the cloth from the basin and folded it and set it on the counter, which was the habit of 11 months of keeping things in order. And she did not look around the kitchen. She had run every day for those 11 months, because looking around, it would have cost her something she did not have. She walked through the door he was holding, and he followed her out, and they walked across the yard of the Greer boarding house in the October morning, and she did not look back. He had a wagon at the rail. He had come for the supply order, which was still in the kitchen, and he did not go back for it. She sat on the bench, and he climbed up beside her and turned the team north out of Morrow, and she sat with her hands in her lap and watched the town go by, and then watched it not be there anymore. And neither of them said anything for a long time, because the thing that had just happened was too large for the first mile and probably for several after it. She said finally, "Where are we going?" He said north. Then he said she could decide that more specifically when she was ready. He said it the way a man says a thing he means precisely, without embellishment, and she heard in it the exact thing she needed to hear, which was that the deciding was hers, and the pace of it was hers, and the only thing that had been decided for her was the getting out, and that part was done. The ranch, when it came over the rise on the North Road, was a working place in good condition. Not large. A house, a barn, a bunkhouse, a pasture where horses moved in the October light. It had the look of a place that was run by someone who knew what he was doing and did it every day without making a production of it. She looked at it and then at him, and he said there was a room in the house that locked from inside, and she could have it for as long as she needed it, and he said his housekeeper had left in the spring, and the kitchen was in the condition of a kitchen that had been managed by a man for 6 months, which was to say it was fed rather than kept. And he was not offering her work, he was offering her a door, and if she wanted to work later, she could decide that later. He was careful about that. She noticed the carefulness and filed it in the place where she put things she was not ready to think about fully. She stayed, the room locked. The kitchen was, indeed, in the condition of a kitchen managed by a man for 6 months, and by the 3rd day she had reorganized it, not because she had decided to stay, but because a disordered kitchen was a thing she could not be in, and the reorganizing was something her hands knew how to do when her mind had not yet caught up to the situation. Tritea said nothing about the reorganizing. He came in for meals when they were ready, and he ate them with the honest appreciation of a man who has been feeding himself badly for 6 months. And he said thank you when the food was good, which it was from the first morning, because cooking was the thing she knew with her whole self. The thing she had been doing since she was old enough to reach a stove, and that no amount of the last 11 months had taken from her. She was not trembling anymore. She noticed this in the 2nd week in the mornings, when the kitchen was quiet and she was the only one in it. The compression she had held herself in for 11 months had not fully released yet, but it was releasing incrementally, in the way that things release when the pressure that caused them is removed, and the body is given time to remember its own shape. The 2 hands, a weathered man named Cass and a younger one called Birch, treated her with the specific courtesy of men who did not know exactly what had happened and had been told enough to know not to ask. They said good morning and thank you for the meals, and stayed out of the kitchen when she needed it to be hers, which it was from the 3rd day when she reorganized it. From the inside out, every shelf and tin and pot and tool put in the place that made the most sense for the work it did, the way she put everything in her life now. In the place that made sense deliberately and with her own hands. In the 4th week, she found the ranch accounts behind a saddle on the shelf in the back room, which was where they apparently lived, because no one had given them a better home. She brought them to the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening and opened the first one, and read through it with the attention she gave all sets of books she was new to, looking for the shape of the operation before looking at the individual figures. The shape was sound. It was the shape of a man who had been running a thing competently and alone for long enough that the books were accurate and disorganized, and showed a ranch that could be doing better than it was if someone were looking at the full picture across the years rather than one season at a time. She began a consolidated ledger on a Wednesday. She did not tell Trace she was doing it. She told herself she would stop if he objected, and she kept going because she could see the figures. And the figures needed organizing, and she was a person who organized what needed organizing. Trace found the consolidated ledger on a Friday evening. He stood at the kitchen table and looked at it for a long moment. Then he sat down across from her and said, she did not have to do this, and she said she was aware, and he said he was grateful, and they sat at the table and went through the figures together, and it was the most she had talked in a single sitting since October, and the talking felt different than it had for 11 months, which was to say it felt like a conversation between two people who were both present in it. In the 5th week, she renegotiated the hay contract she had found in the accounts, which had been running at above the county rate for 2 seasons. She did it by letter, the way she had learned to do things that needed doing, by writing what she meant in the clearest language available, and sending it before she could find a reason not to. Trace received the confirmation of the new rate and showed it to her at the kitchen table, and said she had saved him $40 a year, and she said the rate was in the county paper, and anyone could have found it, and he said yes, but she was the one who had. She kept preparing for Frank. In the mornings, when the kitchen was quiet and her hands were in the bread dough, she was also writing letters to Agnes Cord and to the attorney whose name Agnes had given her, and she was reading the marriage dissolution statutes in the legal digest she had found at the Morrow Library on a Thursday when she had ridden in with Trace for the supply run. She read the statute, the way she read everything now, carefully and completely, looking for the language that controlled and the language that followed, and she found in it exactly what she had hoped to find, which was a path that did not require his cooperation. She did not tell Trace about the preparation, not because she did not trust him, because the preparation was hers, and she needed it to be hers, needed to be the person who had handled it before he arrived, the person who stood in the yard with the document and the argument already made, rather than the person who was handled. Tell me. When he stood in that kitchen doorway and said, "Dry your hands, you're done here," did you understand that the hardest part for her was not leaving, it was believing she was allowed to? Leave your answer in the comments. And take care of yourself. Now, gently, back to the ranch. Frank Greer came on a Thursday. She had known he would. A man like Frank did not lose a thing without coming to collect it, and she was a thing he had possessed, and she had left without his permission. And the not having permission was the part that would drive him more than the loss itself. She had known it since the first morning on the North Road, and she had spent 2 weeks knowing it and preparing for it in the only way she knew how, which was to make herself something he could not easily claim back. She had written to the Cheyenne agency that had brokered the marriage. The agency held the original arrangement papers, and the arrangement papers were relevant because what they described was not quite the marriage he had represented it to be in the letters, and what they contained was a clause she had signed without fully reading at the time, which was what happened when you were 24 and uncertain, and the man across the table seemed reasonable, and you needed to believe him. The clause said the arrangement could be dissolved by either party on grounds of misrepresentation. She had been in the county clerk's office in Morrow while Frank was at the Mercantile in the 2nd week, and she had read the relevant statutes, and the word misrepresentation was in them. She had also written to a woman she had met at the agency the previous November, a woman named Agnes Cord, who had seemed, in the brief acquaintance, to be the kind of person who knew which offices to write to. Agnes had written back inside a week, with the names of 2 attorneys in Cheyenne who handled marriage dissolution cases and who charged on a sliding scale for women in limited circumstances. She had the letters in order, in the desk in her room when Frank Greer came through the yard on a Thursday morning. Trace was at the south fence. She had known he would come in when he saw the wagon, and she had gone to the yard herself first. because whatever Frank had come to say, she intended to be the one who said the first thing, not the one who was introduced into the scene as a possession being discussed. Frank. She said his name. Before he could say hers, she kept her voice even. His face had the expression she knew, the one that was readying itself for a version of this conversation that did not include her having opinions about how it went. "You'll come back," Frank said. He said it with the assurance of a man who has always had the larger context around him, the town's opinion, the legal marriage, the name on the boarding house, the structure that made his version of things, the version that stood up. "This has gone far enough, and you'll come back." She had been preparing for this for 2 weeks, and the preparation had been of the kind that replaces the fear with something more useful, which was information organized into language she could say in a yard, in October, without her voice leaving her. "I have written to the agency that arranged our marriage. The original papers contain a dissolution clause for misrepresentation. I've written to an attorney in Cheyenne, and I have documentation of the misrepresentation, including the letters you wrote prior to the arrangement in which you described conditions that did not exist." She held his gaze. "The attorney expects to have the dissolution filed within the month." Frank's face went through several things, and she watched them all without moving, because she had read those expressions for 11 months, and she knew their sequence. You don't have money for an attorney. The attorney works on a sliding scale. I have been informed that my case qualifies. She kept her voice level and precise and without any of the things she was actually feeling, because this was not the moment for the things she was feeling. This was the moment for the things she had prepared. I am not asking you to agree to this. I am telling you what is happening. The filing will proceed whether or not you agree with it." She paused. "You should speak to your own attorney." Frank looked past her at the house at the yard, at the horses in the pasture. He was doing the arithmetic of the situation, the same arithmetic she had been doing for 2 weeks, and he was arriving at the number she had arrived at, which was that the dissolution with documentation was a worse outcome for him than a dissolution by default, and the default was already happening because she was not there, and the town already knew she had left, and a man in a county town cannot afford for a county to know what the filing would describe. He tried the thing such men try before they accept the arithmetic. He said she had no right to his arrangement papers. The agency correspondence was his business, and she said the agency was a party to the arrangement and kept its own copies, and she had written to the agency directly. He said the attorney on a sliding scale was the attorney of a woman with nothing and was worth nothing, and she said the statute did not ask the attorney's fee in evaluating the merits of the dissolution. He said she would not be able to sustain herself without the boarding house, and she said she had been sustaining herself and a boarding house for 11 months, and she had a fair idea of how sustaining herself worked. Each thing he said she had prepared for. Each answer she had already written out in her notebook the night before, not because she had needed to write it to know it, but because the writing of it had made it irrefutable in her own mind, which was the thing she had needed, to go into this yard knowing that she was right in a way she could not be argued out of. Trace came from the south fence. She had heard him coming across the yard, but she had not looked, and he stopped at her shoulder, and he looked at Frank the way he had looked at the kitchen doorway 6 weeks before, with the plain, steady attention of a man who has assessed a situation and is not going to pretend it is something other than what it is. Frank looked at the two of them, and at the yard, and at the thing that had already happened that he could not unhappen, and he made the decision that Frank Greer would always make, which was the decision that had the least immediate cost to Frank Greer, and he turned his wagon and drove back down the road toward Morrow. She watched him go. She waited until the wagon was off the property and until the sound of it had faded into the north road quiet, and the yard was only the yard again, the horses in the pasture, and the house behind her, and the October sky, the same clear, cold blue it had been all morning, indifferent to what had happened under it in the way that skies are indifferent, which is entirely and helpfully. She let out the breath she had been holding since Thursday morning. She had been ready. She had been ready for 2 weeks, and the readiness had held, and the readiness was hers, and Frank Greer was on the south road, and the yard was clear, and she was still in it, standing on her own 2 feet, which was the thing she had needed to prove to herself more than to anyone else. Trace stood beside her. His eyes went to the road where the wagon had gone, and then back to her, the attorney, the sliding scale. His voice was the same quiet voice as the kitchen doorway, the voice of a man asking a question that is also a statement of what he has just understood. Her own research. She turned from the road. Agnes Cord gave me the names. I wrote 3 weeks ago. He looked at her, the full, direct look he gave things. You had all of it ready before he came. I had 11 months to learn that a person needs to be prepared for the thing before it arrives. She looked at her hands, still steady, which was itself something she had not been certain of when the morning started. She looked at the road where the wagon had gone. He will not come back. It costs him more than leaving it does. She said it not as reassurance, but as analysis, because analysis was what the moment had run on, and she was not ready yet to leave that register for whatever came after it. Trace did not say anything. He went back to the fence, and she went back to the kitchen, and the morning resumed around them in the way. Mornings resume when the thing that was coming has arrived and gone, and the ordinary work of the day is still waiting. The dissolution came through in the 7th week. A document from the Cheyenne court confirming the annulment of the arrangement on grounds of misrepresentation, and she held it in her hands in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning and felt the specific weight of a thing that has been carried long and is now put down. Not relief, exactly, something more like the end of a particular kind of cold, the cold of belonging to a situation that had never been hers, that she had walked into believing it was one thing and discovered too slowly that it was another. She put the document in the desk in her room and came back to the kitchen and made bread, because bread was the thing her hands did when her mind was processing something large, and the bread was the good bread, the bread she had made every morning since the 3rd day. And when it was in the oven, she sat at the kitchen table with her coffee, and she let herself think about what she actually wanted, which was a question she had not been able to ask herself directly in a very long time. What she wanted was this kitchen. Not as a given, not as a thing she had been handed or placed in, but as a thing she had chosen on her own terms, at a table where she could sit down and say so. She wanted the north road and the horses in the pasture, and the account books she had reorganized in the 4th week without being asked, and that she had been managing since, with the precision she brought to everything she managed. She wanted the man who had stood in a doorway on a Thursday morning and said the thing that was both 4 words and the whole of a door opening, and who had then stepped back from it and let her be the one who walked through. She heard Trace come in from the morning check. She heard him at the basin. She heard him pour his coffee and sit at the table, and she looked up from her own cup. He looked at her steadily, the way he always looked at things. The look of a man who had decided some time ago not to look at the surface of things when the substance was available. She set the dissolution document on the table between them. It came through. The words came out quieter than she intended, which was its own kind of answer about what the document meant. He nodded. He had known it was coming. She had told him when she filed, because the arrangement at this ranch was built on telling things rather than not telling them, and she had found that not telling was a weight she could not carry anymore in any direction. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said the thing he had been not saying for 7 weeks, with the same plain care he gave everything. I have a question to ask you, and I want to ask it correctly. He set his cup down. I have been not asking it because there is an order in which it should be asked, and the order required the dissolution first. He held her gaze. The dissolution is first. He paused. What I want to ask is whether you would consider staying here, not as the woman who manages the house for me, but as a person who has decided this is where she wants to be. Not because of what I did in October, not out of any obligation in any direction. He kept his voice plain and even. Because of what you have built here in 7 weeks, in the kitchen and the accounts and the yard, and because of the fact that you had the attorney's letter and the dissolution clause and the documentation ready before Frank came, which told me something I already knew from the first morning you made bread in this kitchen, which is that you are exactly who you are, regardless of who is in the room with you. And I would like to be in the room with you for considerably longer. Nell looked at the bread in the oven and the coffee cup and the dissolution document in her room, and the north road through the kitchen window where the October light was coming in clean and cold and free of everything she had left on the south road 7 weeks before. She looked at the man across the table who had said 4 words in a boarding house kitchen, and then stepped back and waited while she found her own way to every subsequent thing. She thought about what she wanted. She had been allowing herself to think about what she wanted only since the Tuesday morning with the dissolution, and it was a new enough habit that it still surprised her. The size of the answer when she let herself look at it without managing it down to what was available or what was safe or what was the least wrong option. The answer was large and plain and entirely hers. The way the things you have chosen for yourself always are, different in weight and texture from the things that were chosen for you. I'm not going anywhere. She put the words down the way she put down every true thing. Now, plainly and without the weight of someone listening for the wrong answer in them. This is where I am. It is where I chose to be. Every morning since the 3rd day, when I reorganized the kitchen, because I could not be in a disordered kitchen, and because she looked at him steadily, I had already decided I was staying, and I had not admitted that to myself yet. She looked at him across the table. He did not fill the pause, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him, that he did not fill pauses. He let them hold what they held. There is something else I want to say. Something she had been thinking about since the dissolution came and had not known how to put into the right shape without it sounding like a thing it was not. What you did in October. In the kitchen. I have been trying to find the right word for it. And I find, thank you, is not it, because thank you is for a kindness. And what you did was more specific than kindness. She paused. You gave me a door, and then you got out of the way of it, and then you got out of the way of everything that followed, the attorney and the preparation in the yard, and you let me do all of it myself. She held his gaze. I needed to do it myself, and you knew that without me saying so. And you stepped back, and I don't have a word for that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the word was probably just decent, and she said no. It was more than decent, and he said, maybe it was just looking at what was in front of him, and she said, yes, and that was it. That was the whole of what she had been trying to say. He had looked at what was in front of him, in the kitchen and in every day since. He had looked at what was actually there and responded to that, rather than to some prior idea of what it should be, and she had spent 11 months in a kitchen where the opposite was true. And she understood the difference now in the way you understand a thing when you have lived on both sides of it. I'm not going anywhere, as if it were the simplest arithmetic in the world. Trace Dowell. Her name for him, said the first time in the way that names are said, when they have found the place they belong, the way a word sounds when you have been saying it in your own mind for 7 weeks and have finally let it into the room. He nodded once. The matter was closed. He picked up his coffee. She got up to check the bread. They did the ordinary things of the morning, in the way of 2 people who have been sharing a morning kitchen for 7 weeks and know each other's movements without having to navigate them. And the October light came through the window, and the bread came out right, and the north road outside was empty, and entirely hers to look at. She had dried her hands on a cloth in a kitchen she was done with, and walked through a door held open by a man who then stepped back. And she had never let anyone push her through a door again, not even towards something good, because choosing was the thing, and the choosing was hers, and she was very good at it now. The cowboy said, dry your hands. You're done here. She dried her hands. She walked out. And everything that followed, the North Road and the attorney's letter and the dissolution in the kitchen, reorganized on the 3rd day because she had already decided was the work of a woman who had been given a door and had walked through it on her own 2 feet, and had not stopped walking until she arrived at the place she chose. She had done the walking herself. That was the thing she needed to say when anyone asked, which was that the man in the doorway had offered her a door and she had taken it, and the difference between a door offered and a door walked through is the whole of a person's agency, and her agency was the thing she had gotten back the first morning on the North Road, and she had been building on it every day, the letters and the statute and the notebook and the consolidated accounts and the hay contract and the yard in October and the dissolution in the 7th week and the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning when she finally let herself say plainly what was true, until she was standing on ground she had made herself, not rescued to, but walked to, on her own 2 feet, in her own time. She was not going anywhere. The North Road was hers to look at, and the kitchen was hers to stand in. And the choice was hers and always would be. And that was the whole of it. And it was enough. And it was more than enough. And it was everything she had been trying to get back since the morning she understood what she had walked into, and now she had it and she was keeping it. And the bread was on the table, and the morning was hers, and she was not going anywhere at all.